Late at night, the dim glow of the computer screen reflected off Tessa Harper's glasses. In the vast office on the 35th floor, the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the soft clatter of keystrokes and the occasional indistinct sound of someone's deep sigh. Tessa, as polished and authoritative as always, leaned over her screen, yet her eyes, typically sharp and alert, now betrayed a profound weariness. The door suddenly swung open. Nathan Blake stepped inside, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion clearly written across his face after a long day. He carried a thick folder in one hand, his tie already loosened at some point during the evening. "I thought you'd need this," he said, his voice gentle yet unexpectedly loud against the stillness of the room. Tessa glanced up, her observant gaze lingering on him for a moment before she gave a slight nod. "Put it on the desk." Nathan stepped forward, set the folder down but didn't leave right away. He hesitated, as though summoning every ounce of courage to say what was on his mind. Tessa noticed his reluctance, tilting her head slightly, her brow arched. "Anything else, Blake?" she asked, her voice low and edged, cutting through the thickening air like a blade. "I just wanted to ask, are you okay?" The question slipped out faster than he had intended, leaving both of them momentarily stunned. A long silence followed. Tessa stared at him, her gaze suddenly unreadable, as if she were calculating whether or not to respond, or even if she should. "I'm fine," she finally said, her reply clipped and cold. But Nathan wasn't convinced by her detached response. "Are you really?" he pressed, and this time, something in his tone made her pause. It was genuine, unexpected concern. Tessa faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she turned her back to him, gazing out at the vast cityscape beyond the office window. "Why do you care?" Nathan gave a small, self-conscious smile. "Because you're not who everyone thinks you are you? Beneath that strong exterior, I think. There's something more." He trailed off, as though afraid he'd already said too much. But instead of anger, Tessa let out a dry laugh, quiet, laced with sarcasm. "You think you've got me figured out, Blake? Someone who's been here less than 6 months thinks they see something no one else has noticed in 10 years? "Maybe," Nathan said, unfazed. "But sometimes it takes an outsider to see things more clearly." Tessa remained silent, her gaze piercing as if trying to uncover whatever it was that made him so resolute. And then, she chuckled again, this time more softly. "You've got nerve," she remarked, stepping closer to the desk, picking up the folder and flipping through its pages as though signalling the end of the conversation. Yet Nathan didn't budge. He stood his ground, his eyes steady and unwavering, as though waiting for something more profound to emerge. "There are things, Blake, that are best left untouched," Tessa said without looking up, her voice carrying a quiet but unmistakable warning. "You've only scratched the surface. You don't know the cost of looking too far." Nathan didn't move. "Maybe I don't," he admitted, his voice calm but firm. "But I think sometimes you have to cross the line to find out what really matters." This time, Tessa looked up. Her eyes lingered on his face, and for one fleeting moment, the icy composure she wore so well cracked. Beneath it was something fragile, something raw. A crack in the fortress she had built around herself for so many years. But just as quickly, she snapped back to reality. Tessa placed the folder down, crossing her arms in a gesture of finality. "You're good with words, Blake, but you should know that here, words aren't enough. Now go." Nathan knew he had pushed too far, but he didn't regret it. At the door he paused, glancing back at her. "If you ever want someone to listen, I'll be here." Tessa didn't respond. The door clicked shut, leaving her alone with the night and the thoughts that refused to quiet. Nathan's words lingered in her mind, his gaze etched in her memory, as if he had somehow glimpsed a part of her soul she had worked so hard to keep hidden. That night, Tessa sat by the window, staring out at the glittering lights of the city, yet feeling an emptiness that stretched far beyond the skyline. Whether she wanted it or not, Nathan had stirred something inside her, something she wasn't sure she could control, and that terrified her as much as it intrigued her. She remembered Paul, the man she once thought would be the unwavering anchor of her life. They had been the perfect couple, a young woman brimming with ambition and a man with foresight, always encouraging her to chase her dreams. But their marriage had been like a flame that burned too brightly, too quickly, only to extinguish itself in the end. Tessa became consumed by the whirlwind of her career, endless meetings and long business trips, while Paul sought solace elsewhere, somewhere absent of distance and cold detachment. When she discovered his infidelity, instead of anger, she felt hollow, as if it had all been predestined. The divorce was swift. Paul left, taking with him every illusion she had once harboured about a perfect family. She kept the house, not out of nostalgia, but because she needed a place to fill the void inside her. The old piano in the corner of the living room became her only companion. On sleepless nights, she would sit at the keys and let the music tell stories she could never bring herself to admit to anyone. Tessa also thought about her son, Dylan. He had once been her pride, her guiding light in her darkest days. Yet she had failed to be the mother he needed. During the most important milestones of his life, she was always too busy with work. Every promise of an evening together, a vacation, or even a morning conversation had been neglected. Dylan grew up self-reliant and distant, a silent reminder of the price she had paid for her career. These memories often made Tessa question whether it had all been worth it. But she refused to dwell on those feelings for too long. She had to be strong, to prove that she could achieve everything, that she didn't need anyone else to make her happy. Her resilience became the mask she wore every day, concealing every crack in her soul. Nathan entered her life like an unexpected breeze. From their very first conversation, Tessa felt something different. He wasn't like her other employees. He wasn't the type to simply follow orders. Nathan had a bluntness, a boldness, and at times a naivety that caught her off guard. But those very traits reminded her of a younger version of herself, of a time when she still dared to dream and believe that anything was possible. The stories Nathan shared about his past also made her unconsciously open up. He had once been in love with a college sweetheart, a picture-perfect romance that ended bitterly when she chose her career over him. That pain had driven Nathan to constantly seek validation, in his work, his relationships, and now perhaps in her eyes. One evening, when Nathan asked about the piano in her living room, Tessa initially dismissed it with a wry smile, calling it nothing more than a decorative piece. But under his gentle persistence, she sat down and let her fingers glide over the keys. The music flowed out, raw and haunting, telling a story she had kept locked away for so long. When the final note faded, she looked up and met Nathan's gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding and empathy. In that moment, Tessa realized Nathan had seen a part of her no one else ever had. A part of her she had worked so hard to keep hidden. And that realization scared her, not because of him, but because of what she felt. After all these years, could she truly allow herself to be vulnerable with someone again? Their wounds began to find solace in each other during those quiet moments. Tessa and Nathan, each carrying their own pain, their own journeys of loss and loneliness, discovered an unexpected comfort in their connection. Yet that comfort was like a small flame, smouldering quietly, waiting for the right gust of wind to ignite into something uncontrollable, something that could shatter the boundaries they had tried so hard to maintain. That evening, the New York sky was heavy with grey clouds, the city lights dimmer than usual, their glow reflecting faintly against the 35th floor office windows. Tessa Harper sat at her desk, her eyes scanning reports while her mind drifted far away. The echoes of her piano notes from the previous night still lingered in her head, stirring an unnameable feeling she couldn't shake. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Without looking up, Tessa already knew who was there. Nathan Blake stepped in, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. He carried a file in one hand, but didn't place it down immediately, his gaze meeting hers with an ease no other employee dared to show. "I think we should revisit the strategy for this project," he said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. "Do you have a few minutes?" Tessa lifted her eyes, her cold and composed demeanour masking the faint stirrings of warmth within her. "It's late, Blake. You should go home and get some rest." But instead of leaving, Nathan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "And so should you. But I guess neither of us is very good at taking advice." She raised an eyebrow, saying nothing, allowing him to open the file and begin discussing his ideas. She listened, occasionally offering feedback, but they both knew this conversation was about more than work. They were prolonging the moment, neither willing to be the first to leave. As the clock struck 11, Nathan suddenly looked up, something different in his eyes. "Have you had dinner?" he asked, his question catching her off guard. She hadn't imagined an employee asking her something so personal, but instead of feeling offended, she found herself slightly amused. "No," she admitted reluctantly. "Well, then we should get something to eat," he said, standing up with a resolute air. "You can refuse, but if you don't eat, neither of us will be able to think straight." Tessa considered objecting, but his determination made her relent. For the first time in years, she found herself stepping out of the office late at night with someone else. And as they walked together into the bustling city streets, a part of her wondered what she was truly walking into. Tessa looked up, her cold eyes momentarily betraying a hint of weariness. "It's late, Blake. You should get some rest." But instead of leaving, Nathan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "So should you. But I guess neither of us is very good at following advice." She raised an eyebrow, staying silent as he opened the file and began presenting his new ideas. She listened, occasionally giving brief comments, but both of them knew this conversation was not just about work. They were stalling, neither wanting to be the first to leave. As the clock struck 11 p.m., Nathan suddenly looked up, something different glinting in his eyes. "Have you had dinner?" he asked, catching Tessa off guard. She never expected a subordinate to ask her such a question, yet instead of being annoyed, she found it oddly amusing. "No," she admitted reluctantly. "Well, then we should get something to eat." Nathan stood up, his eyes alight with determination. "You can say no, but if we don't eat, neither of us will think clearly." Tessa thought about protesting, but his enthusiasm softened her resistance. And so, for the first time in years, she left the office late at night with a colleague. Nathan took her to a small diner tucked away in a narrow street, where warm golden lights bathed everything in a cozy glow. "I come here when I need to think," he said, as he pulled out a chair for her. "It's quiet, and no one bothers you." They sat across from each other, and for the first time Tessa felt like she wasn't a boss. She was just a woman, having a conversation with a young, passionate man. They talked about everything, from her business trips to the creative projects Nathan was eager to bring to life. But what surprised her the most was the genuine care in his eyes. It wasn't the admiration reserved for a powerful leader, but an attention focused entirely on her as a person. When they left the diner, the rain had started to fall. Cold droplets splashed against her skin, making Tessa shiver. Without hesitation, Nathan shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, a simple gesture that made her slow her steps. "Thank you," she said softly, but she didn't give the jacket back. They walked back to the office in silence, the sound of the rain mingling with their footsteps creating a strangely intimate atmosphere. When they reached the door, Nathan paused, his gaze lingering on her. "Do you want to play the piano upstairs?" he asked. "Last time I heard you, but I didn't really get to see you let loose." The question made Tessa freeze. She stared at him, her eyes torn between logic and emotion. "You should go home," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Yet Nathan didn't move. He stood there, watching her as if waiting for her to make a different decision. And in that moment, Tessa felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Aliveness, a sense of breaking free from the walls she had so carefully constructed. She couldn't quite remember what prompted her decision, but minutes later they were inside her apartment. The warmth of the space, the faint scent of wood, and the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows created an oddly intimate backdrop. Nathan stood beside the old piano, his fingers lightly tracing its worn surface. "Would you play something?" he asked, his voice low, almost like a whisper of invitation. Tessa sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys. Instead of playing one of her usual pieces, she began a melody she had never shared with anyone before. The music filled the room, haunting and deep, pouring out emotions she had buried for years. When the final note faded into silence, Nathan stepped closer, and before she could process what was happening, his hand lightly touched hers. Their eyes met, and Tessa felt as if the world around them had vanished. His kiss came unexpectedly, but it wasn't forceful. It was gentle, like a quiet affirmation of everything they had both felt, but never spoken aloud. In that moment, Tessa didn't think about tomorrow, didn't think about consequences. She simply felt like herself, truly alive for the first time in years. But when the kiss ended, neither of them spoke. No words were needed. They both knew everything had changed. And from that moment on, they found themselves on a path that neither could turn back from. In the days that followed, Tessa sat in her office, the warm glow of the desk lamp softening the weary lines on her face. Papers piled high on her desk went untouched as her mind wandered elsewhere. Her life, once meticulously controlled, now felt like a chaotic storm, all stemming from one rainy night. Nathan had been avoiding her for days, an unspoken silence that made everything even more strained. Tessa understood he needed time, but his absence was a painful reminder of how far they had gone. Worse still were the murmurs in the office, the quick glances from co-workers as she walked down the hall. The rumours had begun to spread, robbing her of sleep night after night. The door to her office swung open without a knock. Claire Davenport, the head of HR and Tessa's longtime confidant, entered with a stern expression. "We need to talk," Claire said, her voice steady but firm. Tessa looked up, her gaze meeting the intense worry on Claire's face. She didn't need to ask. She already knew what this was about. Claire sat down across from her, arms folded across her chest. "Tessa, I've heard what's going on. Don't tell me it's not true." Tessa sat back, her fingers interlaced tightly as if trying to ground herself. She couldn't deny it, but she didn't know how to justify it either. Claire let out a heavy sigh, leaning forward. "I'm not here to judge you, but you need to understand, this isn't just about you. This affects the company, the team, and your reputation. Do you even realise how far the rumours have spread?" Tessa clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Claire, I didn't mean for this to happen. But everything, it's not as simple as you think." Claire studied her for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. "Then make it simple, Tessa. You know better than anyone that this can't continue. Nathan is nearly 20 years younger than you, and you're his superior. If this comes to light, it could ruin both your careers." Tessa felt like she was being cornered, but she couldn't deny that Claire was right. How could she possibly untangle herself from something that had already taken root so deeply within her? She remained silent, and Claire didn't wait for an answer. "You need to end this before it spirals completely out of control," Claire said before standing and leaving the room, leaving Tessa alone with the weight of her choices. Tessa sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the cold cup of coffee on her desk. She couldn't deny it, but she also didn't have the words to justify herself. Claire let out a long sigh and leaned forward, her tone softening just enough to convey her concern. "I'm not here to judge you, Tessa, but you have to understand, this isn't just about you. It affects the company, everyone around you. Do you even realise how far the rumours have spread?" Tessa clenched her fists, her nails pressing into her palms as if the pain could ground her. "Claire, I didn't mean for this to happen. But everything, it's not as simple as you think. Claire's gaze softened but remained firm, a mix of empathy and resolute honesty. Then make it simple, Tessa. You know better than anyone that this can't go on. Nathan is nearly 20 years younger than you, and you're his superior. If this gets out, your career will be over. Tessa felt like she was being backed into a corner. She knew Claire was right, but how could she end something that had embedded itself so deeply in her heart? She stayed silent, and Claire didn't wait for an answer. You need to end it before it spirals completely out of control, Claire said as she stood, leaving Tessa alone with the heaviest thoughts she'd carried in years. That evening, Nathan appeared at her office door. His face was tense, his eyes burning with a restrained anger. "We need to talk," he said, his tone making it clear she wouldn't be able to deflect him this time. Tessa didn't know how to face him, but she understood that avoiding the conversation would only make things worse. They stepped inside her office and Nathan closed the door behind him. The small space immediately felt stifling, the air heavy with unspoken tension. "What are you going to do, Tessa?" he asked, his voice trembling, not from fear but from disappointment. "Are you going to pretend nothing happened, or are you just going to keep running away from me?" Tessa sat down in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together. "Nathan, we can't do this. Claire is right. This will destroy both of us." Nathan shook his head and stepped closer, his eyes filled with anguish. "I don't care about the rumors, Tessa. The only thing I care about is you. I know you feel the same way I do, so why are we running from this?" His words hit her like a sharp blade, cutting through the turmoil in her heart. But her rational mind fought back. "You don't understand, Nathan. I built this career from nothing. I can't let it all fall apart because of feelings." Nathan stared at her, his eyes glinting with a dangerous mix of pain and defiance. "And what about my feelings? Do you think I haven't thought this through before stepping into this with you? Do you think I don't know what I'm up against? But I made a choice, Tessa. What about you?" Tessa stood, stepping back as though trying to create physical distance between them. "Nathan, I can't do this. I'm sorry." A bitter smile crept across Nathan's face. "You can't, or you won't. Maybe you never trusted me in the first place." That sentence struck at her deepest fear. Tessa froze, unable to find any words as Nathan turned toward the door. But before he left, he stopped, his voice lower, heavier. "If you won't fight for this, then everything we've been through means nothing." The door clicked shut, and Tessa felt as though her world had collapsed. His words echoed in her mind, refusing to let her rest. But as she gazed out the window, watching his shadow disappear down the dimly lit hallway, she knew she had lost him, at least for now. She had chosen the safer path, but the price was a deep, gnawing emptiness that she knew would haunt her forever. Tessa stood motionless by the large window of her apartment, the faint glow of streetlights outside casting pale reflections on the glass, shadowing her face. The city below thrummed with life, but inside her, everything had fallen silent. The days since Nathan had left were an endless void. She worked like a machine, mechanical and soulless, brushing off every look, every whisper in the office. But she couldn't escape the persistent ache of loss in her chest. Nathan was no longer at the office. His absence was a void she couldn't bear to confront directly. Management had started to ask questions, and Claire tried to smooth things over, saying Nathan was taking personal leave. But Tessa knew better. He had left, and there was no guarantee he'd ever return. One morning, as she flipped through a stack of reports, an envelope sat quietly on her desk. There was no sender, just a plain white paper that felt oddly heavy in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a small card with a few neat handwritten words. "Little cafe on Green Street, 7 p.m. I'll be waiting." The message was simple, yet it set her heart racing in a way she hadn't felt in years. Tessa stared at the card, torn between apprehension and longing. She knew exactly who had sent it, and as the hours ticked by, the question lingered in her mind. Would she go? Could she allow herself to face him one more time? Tessa felt her heart pounding in her chest. She knew exactly who had sent the note, but a wave of hesitation rose within her. Weeks had passed. Should she face him again? Could she? At 7 p.m. that evening, Tessa stepped into the small cafe. The gentle glow of warm lights and the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee created a space that felt unusually comforting. Nathan sat in a corner near the window, his hand wrapped around a cup of coffee while his eyes gazed out into the fading daylight. He seemed lost in thought, unaware of her arrival. Tessa paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before she made her way to him. Nathan turned as she approached, his gaze soft yet tinged with a hint of distance, as if he had learned to mask his emotions. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and calm. Tessa sat down, her hands resting on the table, her palms touching as though seeking some form of stability. "Nathan, I don't know where to start," she began, her eyes meeting his. "What I did, what I said, none of it was fair to you." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, his expression patient, as though waiting for her to say everything she needed to. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Scared of losing everything I've built, scared of being judged, and maybe scared of letting myself love someone again." "You think I wasn't scared?" Nathan finally spoke, his tone not angry but laced with quiet pain. "I've been afraid since the moment I realized how I felt about you. But I chose to face that fear because I believed you felt the same." Tessa lowered her head, his words cutting through the armor she had so carefully constructed. "You're right," she whispered. "I did feel it, but I didn't know how to handle it." Nathan set his cup down, his hands gently reaching for hers. "Tessa, none of us can predict the future. But what I do know is that if we keep running away, we'll regret it for the rest of our lives." In that moment, it felt as if the noise of the world around them disappeared, leaving just the two of them in their own small universe. Tessa looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be honest. "I don't want to run anymore," she said softly, her voice steady despite its quiet tone. "If you're willing to move forward with me, I'll try." A faint smile appeared on Nathan's lips, not wide, but genuine. "I've been waiting to hear that," he said quietly. They sat there for a long time after that, exchanging few words but sharing countless unspoken ones through their gazes. Together, they had made a choice not to let their past or their fears dictate their future. Sometimes love isn't about perfection or certainty. Sometimes it's simply two people daring to embrace each other's imperfections and deciding to walk forward together, no matter how uncertain or challenging the road ahead might be.